It was a typical morning in the courthouse. The sound of shuffling papers, the occasional clink of a gavel, and the murmurs of people awaiting their turn created a backdrop of routine in the bustling legal system. Judge Laura Connors had seen her fair share of cases, some more complex than others. But today's was expected to be simple. Jessica Taylor stood before her, accused of a minor assault after an altercation at a local bar. The defendant's eyes were steady, almost too calm for someone who was facing a legal charge. She had the look of a woman who had been through battles, silent, internal ones, but this wasn't just another bar fight. The prosecutor outlined the case with confidence, painting Jessica as the aggressor. Surveillance footage was presented showing Jessica in a heated argument with another woman, followed by a shove that sent her opponent crashing to the ground. On the surface, it seemed like a clear-cut case of public disorder. The victim, a local college student, had suffered a sprained wrist and a bruised ego. But Jessica, despite being the defendant, didn't appear fazed. She sat quietly, her arms crossed, her eyes focused on something far beyond the courtroom's walls. Her lawyer, a seasoned public defender named David Lawson, was preparing his argument when he dropped the first hint. "Your Honor," Lawson began, adjusting his glasses, "I would like to bring to light certain details about my client's background. Ms. Taylor is a woman who has experienced things that many in this room cannot even imagine. Before this incident, she served her country in the military, specifically as a combat medic." The mention of the military caused a subtle shift in the courtroom. Some faces turned in surprise, others in curiosity. Judge Connors leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing with interest. Jessica had not mentioned anything about her military service before. It hadn't come up in the pretrial interviews. Judge Connors was used to the occasional mention of someone's service, but the way it was delivered made it sound significant. The courtroom was abuzz with new questions. Why hadn't this been mentioned before? Was it relevant to the case? David Lawson continued, "Ms. Taylor's time in the service, and the circumstances under which she returned home, have undoubtedly influenced her actions today. I ask you to consider her past as we proceed with this case." The judge nodded slowly, her mind working through the layers of this new revelation. She had seen plenty of cases where military backgrounds were brought up, but it was rare for it to surface so unexpectedly. As the defense lawyer spoke, it became evident that Jessica's background wasn't just a piece of information. It was the key to understanding what had led to this incident. It was as if the room itself had shifted its focus from the present to something deeper, more complex. Jessica's calm demeanor remained, but the moment seemed to carry an unspoken weight. The courtroom, once filled with routine legal exchanges, had now become a place where past experiences, long buried, could no longer be ignored. As Judge Connors considered the new information, she realized this case was about more than just a minor assault. It was about understanding the impact of one person's hidden history on their present life. Judge Connors glanced down at the case file, her hand hovering over it, as she pondered the direction this case would take. It was clear that Jessica Taylor's past, something only hinted at so far, would be a game changer. And with that realization, the judge's ruling might end up being anything but ordinary. The revelation of Jessica Taylor's military background had set the stage for something far more profound than anyone had expected. The defense lawyer's words had echoed through the courtroom, and it was clear that Judge Connors was taking this new information seriously. The room, once filled with the low hum of routine legal proceedings, now seemed quieter. People shifted in their seats, trying to process the significance of what they had just heard. Jessica remained still, her eyes focused ahead, betraying no emotion as the court absorbed the news. Judge Connors didn't immediately respond. Instead, she took a moment to let the weight of the words settle. A veteran. It wasn't something she had anticipated, especially given the quiet nature of the defendant. She knew that military service could have lasting effects, but she hadn't yet fully considered how that might connect to the case before her. It was clear that this wasn't just a simple assault. There were layers to Jessica's story that the courtroom had yet to uncover. David Lawson, Jessica's attorney, sensed the shift in the atmosphere, and seized the moment. "Your Honor, I ask that you consider the full context of my client's service," he continued, his voice steady but urgent. Ms. Taylor served in some of the most difficult conditions as a combat medic. What you see before you today, in this courtroom, is a woman who has borne the invisible scars of war. The incident in question is, in part, a manifestation of the trauma she carries. The prosecutor, clearly caught off guard by this turn of events, cleared their throat. "Objection, Your Honor. The defendant's military service is irrelevant to the current charges. We are here to address a simple case of assault." Judge Connors, who had been quiet, raised her hand slightly, signaling for the courtroom to calm. She could sense that this case was not as simple as it appeared. The prosecutor's objection was valid on the surface, but there was something deeper at play. She had seen it before, the invisible wounds of war. Veterans, especially those who had served in combat, often faced challenges that the rest of society couldn't fully grasp. And while the law had its clear definitions, there were aspects of human experience that the law couldn't always address directly. "Overruled," Judge Connors said, her voice firm but respectful. "The context of the defendant's background will be taken into consideration. We will continue with the proceedings, but I will allow the defense to present any relevant information about Ms. Taylor's service." The defense attorney nodded and gestured for Jessica to speak, though she had remained silent up to this point. There was a pause as Jessica took a slow breath, clearly preparing herself for what she was about to share. The entire room seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Finally, Jessica stood up, her movements deliberate and controlled. The weight of the moment was not lost on her, but there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. Her eyes, though soft, spoke volumes as she began to speak. "I enlisted when I was 21. Jessica's voice was steady, but there was a slight tremor that hinted at the emotion beneath the surface. "I wanted to make a difference. I trained as a combat medic, and for years I did my job, helping my comrades when they were hurt, patching wounds, saving lives." She paused for a moment, looking out at the faces in the courtroom, as if measuring the impact of her words. "But after I came home, everything changed," she continued, her tone quieter now, as though the memories were too heavy to bear. "No one tells you what it's like to come back. You're expected to just pick up where you left off, but it's not that simple. The war stays with you. It never really leaves." Jessica's words hung in the air, and the courtroom, once so focused on legalities, was now listening to something much more personal. There was no turning back now. The audience, judge, lawyers, and spectators alike, had begun to understand that Jessica Taylor was not just a defendant in a simple case. She was a person who had carried the weight of war on her shoulders for years, and that weight had shaped her actions in ways no one had anticipated. Judge Connors leaned forward, her expression softened, reflecting a deep empathy for the woman before her. Jessica's past had been revealed, but the full extent of her story had only just begun to unfold. This case was no longer just about an assault. It was about understanding the complexity of a person, shaped by the unspoken realities of service, trauma, and the search for healing in a world that often didn't know how to help. Jessica Taylor's testimony continued to echo through the courtroom, leaving an indelible mark on everyone present. She paused again, her eyes lingering on the far wall of the courtroom, as if looking for something she couldn't quite reach. The air was thick with anticipation, her next words hanging on the edge of silence. "I didn't know how to come back. I thought I was supposed to be the same person I was before I left," Jessica continued, her voice steady but tinged with the vulnerability that had crept in. "But I wasn't, and I didn't know who to talk to about it. People don't understand. They say, 'Thank you for your service,' but what they don't say is, 'What happened to you when you came home?'" Her words struck a chord in the courtroom, and even the prosecutor, who had been focused solely on the case at hand, couldn't help but feel the gravity of what she was sharing. It wasn't just a defense against the charges. This was an intimate portrayal of the reality many veterans faced, particularly those who returned from combat zones. The defense attorney, David Lawson, took a step forward, ready to continue his line of questioning. "Jessica, could you tell the court what you experienced during your service? What was it like, being in a war zone?" Jessica's gaze drifted to the side, her fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the witness stand. The memories were still vivid, but she had learned to push them down over the years. Now, with the weight of the courtroom focused on her, she knew she had to speak. It was constant, she began, her voice growing quieter. "There was never a moment when you could just relax. You were always alert, always thinking about the next thing that could go wrong. But then there were the moments when you saved a life. You'd stabilize someone, you'd get them out of there, and you'd think, maybe today I made a difference. But when you're done and you're back at base, there's still this hollow feeling. You keep moving because you have to, but inside, it's like everything is broken." The courtroom, once cold and impersonal, now felt like a place where the audience was privy to something raw, something real. Jessica spoke of the long hours, the exhausting days, the endless fear of what could happen next. She spoke of the soldiers she had helped, the ones she couldn't save, the faces that haunted her long after she left the battlefield. "The hardest part wasn't the blood or the screams," she continued, the weight of her words settling in. "It was knowing that some of the people you cared about were never going to make it back. And then, when you come home, you're supposed to just move on. They say, you're safe now, you're home. But it doesn't feel like that. You don't feel safe. You feel like you're trapped in a nightmare, and no one understands." There was a collective breath held in the courtroom as Jessica's story painted a clear picture. The harsh realities of war were not just limited to the battlefield. They extended far beyond, shaping the lives of those who had served. Her vulnerability in that moment revealed the depth of her struggle, a struggle that she had tried to bury for years, but which had surfaced in that single incident that had brought her to court. Judge Connors looked down at her notes, her mind racing. This wasn't just a legal case anymore. This was about understanding a human being's journey, the weight of her past, and how it had shaped her present. She had seen the scars that came with military service, but hearing Jessica's story, hearing the words come from her own mouth, made everything so much more tangible. Jessica took a deep breath, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. She wasn't finished, not yet. There was more to say, more to explain. The trauma she carried wasn't just something she could leave behind. It was something that followed her, lurking in the background, affecting every aspect of her life. And now, for the first time, she was ready to confront it in front of the world. "I wasn't prepared for how hard it would be to come home," Jessica said, her voice growing more steady now, as if a weight had been lifted. "I wanted to be the person I was before, but I wasn't. And that's when things started to fall apart. I didn't know how to deal with it, and I didn't know how to talk to anyone. I didn't want people to see me as weak, so I kept it all inside." The room was silent. No one moved, no one spoke. The raw honesty of her words had transformed the entire atmosphere. The judge, who had always prided herself on her professional detachment, felt a flicker of empathy for the woman standing before her. This was no longer just about the law. This was about understanding the complexities of the human experience, and Jessica Taylor's story was a painful but necessary part of that understanding. As Jessica's testimony echoed in the courtroom, it was clear that the case had taken a turn no one had anticipated. What had started as a simple legal matter, a bar fight, a misdemeanor charge, had quickly become something far more complex. The moment Jessica's military background had been revealed, it ignited a firestorm of media attention, and the ripple effect was felt across the country. News outlets seized upon the story, framing it in a way that was both sensational and deeply human. Headlines screamed of Jessica's service, her trauma, and her fight for understanding. Some outlets took a sympathetic approach, painting her as a victim of war who had never received the help she needed when she returned home. Others were less kind, questioning whether her past as a combat medic should be considered an excuse for the altercation that had led her to the courtroom. On social media, The story quickly became a topic of heated debate. Hashtags like #VeteranJustice and #SupportForVeterans trended across multiple platforms as people from all walks of life shared their thoughts on the case. Many veterans, particularly women who had served in combat roles, saw a reflection of their own struggles in Jessica's story. The conversation around the case wasn't just about one woman's actions. It was about the larger issue of how veterans, particularly women, were treated when they came home. The isolation, the mental health challenges, the lack of support, it all became part of the national dialogue. Veteran advocacy groups jumped into the conversation, calling attention to the high rates of PTSD among female veterans and the challenges they faced in reintegrating into civilian life. "It's not just about one incident," said one veteran advocate in an interview. "It's about the broader issue of how our system fails to support those who serve." Jessica is a symbol of the struggle many of us face when we come home. We need to start talking about these issues. But not everyone was sympathetic. Some voices in the media questioned whether Jessica's service could really excuse her actions. There were those who saw her military background as irrelevant, insisting that the focus should remain on the assault itself. What does her time in the military have to do with this? One op-ed argued, if she can't control herself in public, it doesn't matter what she did in the past. Everyone should be accountable for their actions. The public response was split down the middle. There were those who saw Jessica as a victim of circumstance, someone who had been failed by the very system she had served. And there were others who believed that, regardless of her background, the law must be upheld, and that her actions couldn't be excused simply because she had been a soldier. Jessica's family, meanwhile, remained largely out of the public eye. They had seen firsthand the toll that her service had taken on her, but they were unsure how to navigate the media storm. They knew their daughter, their sister, was not a villain. They understood the trauma she carried, but they also knew that the legal system was not designed to account for the psychological wounds of war. For Jessica, the media frenzy was both comforting and overwhelming. It gave her voice to a struggle she had kept hidden for so long, but it also thrust her into a spotlight she wasn't sure she was ready for. As she watched the news coverage from the safety of her lawyer's office, she wondered how her story had come to represent so much more than just one woman's personal battle. This case, now being discussed in living rooms and newsrooms across the nation, had become a symbol, a reminder of the lingering wounds of war and the way they often went unnoticed in civilian life. And then there was the impact on Judge Connors. She, too, found herself immersed in the public debate. Known for her impartiality, Judge Connors felt the weight of the case in a new way. Her decision would carry consequences far beyond the courtroom, and she couldn't ignore the larger implications. For better or worse, Jessica's story had become a mirror for society's understanding of its veterans, and it would force everyone involved to examine how they viewed those who had served their country. The media frenzy was just the beginning. The case was now part of a larger conversation about justice, trauma, and how to support those who served. And as the trial continued, it became clear that the real battle wasn't just happening in the courtroom. It was unfolding in public opinion. As the days passed, the courtroom drama continued, but for Jessica Taylor, it was becoming more than just a trial. It had become a reflection of the inner conflict she had long tried to suppress. The assault charge was one thing, but the public's reaction to her past, the constant scrutiny of her military service, her trauma, her humanity, was something else entirely. Every day, she saw how people tried to turn her into a symbol, either of strength or weakness, of justice or failure. But Jessica was neither of those things. She was just a woman who had served her country and then tried, unsuccessfully, to return to a world that didn't understand her. Sitting in the back of her lawyer's office, Jessica found herself growing increasingly agitated. The weight of the media attention, the constant barrage of questions from journalists, and the public's opinions were closing in on her. She had spent years trying to suppress the memories, the nightmares, the anger. Now, every part of her past was being dragged into the light, and it felt suffocating. "Jess, we need to focus," David Lawson said gently, snapping her out of her thoughts. "I know this isn't easy, but we have to stay on course. The public perception, it's not what matters right now. What matters is the court and the case." Jessica nodded, her eyes hollow. David, a seasoned attorney, had been with her through every twist and turn of this trial. But even he couldn't fully understand the turmoil she was facing. He had spent years in the courtroom, but this wasn't a legal case anymore. It was about the very essence of Jessica's identity, and that was something no legal strategy could fix. "I just don't know if I can do this anymore," Jessica whispered, the vulnerability slipping through. "I don't know if I can keep going through this circus. I don't know how to make them understand." David sat down across from her, his face softening. "I know it's hard, but you're not alone in this. And this trial, it's about showing them who you are. You've been through hell, and we need to make sure the court understands that. Your past isn't a shield. It's part of the story we have to tell." Her hands trembled as she pressed them against her forehead. "I just want it to end. I just want to go back to a normal life." David leaned forward, his voice firm but compassionate. "This is your life, Jessica. This is where the healing begins, whether you're found guilty or not. This case is about you taking control of your story." The courtroom was a battleground of legal strategies, but it was also a place where personal histories were laid bare. And for Jessica, the trial had become a battleground in ways she had never expected. As much as she wanted to retreat into the quiet, to hide from the world that now knew her name, she knew that would only allow the trauma to win. The days between the court sessions were becoming increasingly difficult for Jessica. Her nights were plagued with nightmares, flashbacks to the war, to the lives she couldn't save. When she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the soldiers she had cared for, faces that would never smile again, never speak again. She wondered if those faces would haunt her forever, if the weight of their lives would never release her. But then there were moments of clarity, moments when she would walk down the quiet hallways of her apartment building, her hand brushing the walls as she passed, and she would remember why she joined the military in the first place. It wasn't about glory or fame. It was about helping others. It was about making a difference in the lives of people who needed it most. But now, in this cold and clinical courtroom, Jessica was being asked to defend herself, not just as a soldier, but as a person. And the lines between those two identities had become blurred in a way she didn't know how to untangle. Judge Connors, too, was beginning to feel the weight of the case. Every day, she saw the strain on Jessica's face, the way the young woman seemed both resolved and fragile. It wasn't lost on her that this trial was more than just a simple legal matter. It was an exploration of the human condition. How could the court reconcile Jessica's past with her present actions? How could the law account for the complexities of trauma, of survival, of returning home from war to a society that didn't know how to heal? Jessica's trial wasn't just a question of guilt or innocence. It was a question of understanding. And as the days wore on, it became increasingly clear that everyone involved would have to confront their own assumptions, their own beliefs, and perhaps even their own blind spots. Because Jessica was not just a defendant. She was a reflection of a larger, more uncomfortable reality that could no longer be ignored. As the trial entered its final week, the tension in the courtroom reached its peak. Every word spoken, every argument made, felt heavy with the consequences of the decision that was looming. Jessica's testimony had shaken the room, and Judge Connors could feel the burden of the case weighing on her shoulders. She had seen many trials in her career, but this one was different. It was no longer just about the law. It was about the human experience, the complexities of trauma, and the struggles faced by veterans who returned home from war. David Lawson, Jessica's defense attorney, had made his case. He had laid out the argument that Jessica's actions were not the result of malice, but of an unseen wound, one that no one could fully understand unless they had lived it. The prosecutor had countered with a firm stance, emphasizing that the law could not excuse violence, no matter the circumstances. The debate was civil, but beneath it, there was an undeniable tension, a realization that the outcome of this trial could have far-reaching consequences. The final day of arguments arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. Jessica sat in the witness box, her expression distant. She had spoken her truth, but now, as the trial neared its conclusion, she felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion. The weight of the case, the public scrutiny, and the constant reminders of her past had drained her. The battle she had waged for years inside her own mind had now become a battle for her future in front of strangers. Judge Connors called the court to order, her voice steady but reflective. She had listened carefully to every word, but now the moment of judgment had arrived. The prosecutor stood first, ready to make one last argument. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the defendant's military service and the undeniable hardships she faced, we must remember that the law is blind to personal circumstance. The actions that occurred on the night in question, regardless of the defendant's background, cannot go unpunished. Violence in any form must be held accountable. The law is clear. Assault is assault. The words stung. Jessica felt them deep in her chest, as though they were an accusation against her very existence. She had tried to explain that she wasn't a violent person, that she had been a healer in the most brutal circumstances, but the prosecutor was right. Violence could not be excused, not by her service, not by her trauma. David Lawson rose next, his tone firm but measured. Your Honor, we are not asking for leniency based on a technicality or an excuse. We are asking for understanding. Jessica Taylor did not ask for the scars she bears. She didn't ask to be sent into war. She didn't ask for the trauma that followed her home. But she's here now, standing before you, trying to reclaim her life. Yes, what happened that night was wrong. But we ask that you look at her not just as a defendant, but as a woman who has fought in ways that none of us will ever fully understand. His words resonated, but the room remained tense. Jessica's gaze remained fixed ahead, trying not to let the emotional turmoil show on her face. She wasn't sure what would happen next. She knew that her life, the future she had worked so hard to build, was in the hands of Judge Connors. But it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the countless other veterans, the men and women who had come home and struggled to find peace in a world that didn't always know how to support them. Judge Connors sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing on her. She had seen the arguments, heard the testimony, and understood the stakes. This was a case that would resonate beyond the courtroom, one that would force people to consider the hidden costs of war, the emotional and psychological tolls that often go unrecognized. Finally, Judge Connors spoke, her voice measured but full of compassion. I have spent many years on this bench, and I have seen cases that were straightforward, cases that required little more than the application of law. But this case is different. It requires more than just a judgment of guilt or innocence. It requires us to ask difficult questions about justice, trauma, and what it means to be human. Ms. Taylor's service to her country cannot be erased. The struggles she faced after returning home are real and undeniable. But we must also acknowledge that her actions that night were a violation of the law. And in the eyes of the law, there are consequences for that. The room grew still as Judge Connors paused, the weight of her words settling in. Jessica's heart pounded in her chest, her breath shallow. She knew that whatever came next, her life would be forever altered. But in that moment, she also understood that this trial, and the attention it had brought, was larger than just her. It was a reflection of the way society viewed its veterans, and how much more needed to be done to address the invisible wounds of war. Judge Connors took a deep breath and continued. The decision in this case will not be made lightly. I will take all factors into account before issuing my ruling. The courtroom was quieter than it had ever been. The tension was palpable as Judge Connors spent the days after the closing arguments deliberating. It had been a week since the final speeches, but the echoes of the case still lingered in the air. Jessica sat in her lawyer's office, unable to focus on anything other than the looming verdict. The weight of it all was suffocating. Her mind raced through the memories, the good and the bad. of her service, of the nights she spent in foreign lands, of the faces she tried to save, and the faces she couldn't. David Lawson, who had worked tirelessly throughout the trial, sat across from her, a look of quiet resolve on his face. He knew how much this meant to Jessica, but he also knew that the decision now rested in the hands of Judge Connors. There was no way to predict which way the gavel would fall. "We've done everything we can," David said, his voice calm but tinged with concern. "It's in her hands now. Just remember, no matter what happens, you've shown the world who you are. And you've shown that the fight isn't just about the law. It's about understanding what our veterans go through." Jessica nodded, though her mind was elsewhere. The media attention, the public debate, and the pressure of being the face of something far bigger than herself had made it hard for her to find peace. But in that silence, with the weight of the courtroom still pressing against her, she tried to reflect on the journey she had taken, from the battlefield to the stand. For the first time, she allowed herself to truly feel the depth of her experience, the emotional toll it had taken, and the courage it had required to stand up and speak the truth. The phone rang, breaking her reverie. David answered quickly, and Jessica felt her pulse spike in an instant. His face remained neutral, but she could tell something was happening. He hung up and turned to her. "It's time," he said quietly. Jessica's heart skipped. The world seemed to slow as they made their way to the courtroom. As she entered, the usual buzz of activity fell into a hushed silence. All eyes were on the judge, whose stern expression only deepened as she prepared to make her ruling. Jessica's breath caught in her throat, and her hands trembled slightly as she took her seat. Judge Connors had taken her time. That was clear. It wasn't just the case of one woman. It was a case that would send ripples through the system, that would force the country to confront how it treated its returning soldiers. Everyone in the room knew this would be a landmark moment. Judge Connors cleared her throat, looking at Jessica with a thoughtful expression. "Ms. Taylor," she began, her voice measured, "I have listened closely to the testimonies and reviewed all the evidence presented. What you did that night was undeniably wrong. There is no question that your actions were harmful, and they deserve to be addressed." Jessica's stomach twisted, but she knew the judge was right. There was no denying what had happened. She had lost control. The scars of her past had boiled over into that moment, and she had hurt someone. No matter how much she tried to explain her actions, the law could not bend to her personal history. She had to take responsibility. But, Judge Connors continued, what this court must also recognize is the context in which these events occurred. You did not act out of malice, but out of years of trauma and pain. It is clear from your testimony, and the evidence provided, that the mental health toll of your military service is real, and it has shaped your life in ways that can't simply be ignored. Jessica held her breath, trying not to let the emotions welling up inside her take over. She had prepared herself for the worst. She had expected the harshest penalty. But now, as the judge's words hung in the air, she dared to hope that there might be a way forward for her, a way that didn't condemn her for the struggles she had been unable to overcome. Judge Connors paused, allowing her words to settle. Then she spoke again, with a conviction that seemed to echo in every corner of the courtroom. "In recognition of your service, your honesty, and the significant strides you have made toward addressing your trauma, I am sentencing you to probation with mandatory counseling and support for veterans' mental health. This court will require you to engage in a rehabilitation program, and we will monitor your progress. Your past actions will not go unacknowledged, but this decision reflects a belief in your potential for redemption and recovery." Jessica's chest tightened, her heart racing. The judge's words weren't an acquittal, but they weren't a sentence to prison either. It was a chance for her to continue her journey toward healing, to confront her past and work toward a future that wasn't defined by the mistakes she had made. The room remained still for a moment before murmurs began to ripple through the audience. Some of the spectators, especially those sympathetic to veteran struggles, seemed relieved. Others, particularly those who felt that justice had not been fully served, were less than pleased. But for Jessica, the verdict was a lifeline. David Lawson turned to her, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "It's not over, Jess, but you've got a chance." Tears welled in her eyes as she stood up, feeling the weight lift from her shoulders. It wasn't the perfect outcome, but it was a beginning. And in that moment, Jessica Taylor realized that the road ahead, though uncertain, was one she was finally ready to walk. The courtroom slowly emptied as the reality of the verdict began to settle in. Jessica stood motionless for a moment, her heart still racing, her mind processing everything that had just happened. The noise of the room faded, replaced by the quiet beat of her own thoughts. She had expected to feel relief, but instead there was an overwhelming sense of both hope and uncertainty. The verdict had given her a chance, but it was up to her to prove she could change, to prove she could overcome the damage of the past. As she made her way out of the courtroom, David Lawson was by her side, offering quiet reassurance. "This isn't the end, Jessica. It's the first step. You have the chance now to focus on your healing, to rebuild. And you're not alone in this." Jessica nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the edge of something new, something unknown. The weight of the trial still lingered, but now it was replaced by the daunting reality of what lay ahead. She had been given a second chance, but it wasn't one that came with any guarantees. The road to healing would be long and fraught with challenges, but it was hers to walk. As she left the courthouse and stepped into the cool air outside, Jessica felt a small sense of freedom. The crowds that had gathered outside to watch the trial unfold had mostly dispersed, but a few curious onlookers still watched her with guarded interest. She couldn't escape the scrutiny, but for the first time, it felt like something she could manage. David followed her, his voice steady as he spoke. "We've already got a plan in place for the counseling and mental health support. It's time to face everything you've been running from, Jess. I know it won't be easy, but I believe you can do it." The weight of those words hit her harder than she had expected. She wasn't used to hearing belief in her abilities. In the military, her focus had always been on others, on the soldiers she had cared for, on the lives she had tried to save. But now, for the first time, someone was asking her to believe in herself. Jessica's steps were slow, but steady as she walked away from the courthouse. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows on the pavement, but it wasn't the darkness that consumed her thoughts. It was the light. A small but real hope flickered in her heart. The decision had been made, and though it wasn't perfect, it was an opportunity to rebuild. The next few months would test her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The counseling would be hard, and there would be moments of doubt. But Jessica was no stranger to adversity. She had fought in battles where the stakes were higher than anyone could understand, and now she was fighting for herself. As she began the next chapter of her life, the echoes of the courtroom, the media attention, and the public debate faded into the background. It wasn't that they didn't matter. It was that she had finally begun to take control of her own story. She was no longer just a veteran defined by her trauma. She was a woman fighting for redemption, for peace, and for the chance to create a future that reflected the strength she had carried all along. Judge Connor's ruling had been a turning point, not just in the trial, but in Jessica's life. The verdict had shown that the law could be a tool for understanding, not just punishment. And as she walked away from the courthouse, Jessica felt the first real sense of freedom she had experienced in years. The journey ahead would be difficult, but for the first time in a long while, she was ready to face it. For Jessica Taylor, the trial wasn't the end of her story, it was the beginning of her healing.